Chinese labor costs have already increased by a factor of 14 in the last 22 years. That's the fastest in human history, including in wartime. So this doesn't work anymore. It's just a question of how it crashes.
Huh.
And for the Chinese, there is not a gateway equivalent like there is for the Russians. They are perfectly capable of just imploding and going away. Now, there's any number of ways how that implosion could go, but I'm really not too worried about the Chinese launching a war. Because even if they conquered Taiwan in a day, they're still dependent upon the rest of the world for all their industrial inputs. So any country that was angry with them, let's lift off a few. The US, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, India. You put 2 destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and you cut the energy line. And that's it. 3 months later, the lights go out in China. 3 months after that, I got that backwards. 3 months later, the trucks stop running. 3 months after that, the lights go out. And a year later, they've got 500 million dead Chinese due to famine. The Chinese are utterly dependent upon globalization. And so whenever the United States says they're not interested in it anymore, the Chinese get really terrified, and they should. The Russians made it very clear in the 90s that if you come north of the border, we're just going to nuke you because we can't meet you soldier to soldier. Going to India, because the Himalayas are in the way, that just leaves Vietnam. And the last time they invaded Vietnam, it was in 1979, and the Vietnamese treated them with the same welcome that they treated us. And the Chinese know that that's not worth it. So that's it. That's all their land border. I mean, I guess I could go into North Korea. That's another one of the what does the winner get questions. We've got some pressures. With the retirement of the baby boomers, we're losing our single largest worker cadre and our greatest concentration of skilled labor. That was always going to happen when they retired, and here we are. Half of the baby boomers will have retired by the end of this year. So we're at the peak right now. Gen X was always going to be a smaller generation, and they also have a lower labor participation rate because they're far less likely to be 2-income families. Gen X tends to value their time and their family time just as much as their money, as opposed to the boomers who went for the money over the time. So boomers have a high divorce rate. Xers have a very low divorce rate.
Interesting. Never thought of it in those terms before. That's fascinating.
Now that Xers are going to be the old guys, we're finally seeing labor appreciation, which is really comfortable for the Xers, but it's really bad for everybody else because there's just not enough. The millennials, whether it's because they took an extended adolescence or because they entered the workforce in the 2000s and got screwed by the financial crisis, have lost 3 to 5 years of work experience, and they'll always be behind. And then Gen Z is just as small as Gen X. So we know what the labor situation is for the next 20 years. It's going to be tight. We have to wait for the 2040s for this to loosen up. This is just how things are. But it's American demographics goes boomers, Xers, millennials, Zoomers.
Interesting.
Everyone else in the world goes boomers, Xers, millennials, Zoomers.
Wow.
The one thing that our baby boomers did differently is they had kids. That didn't happen in most places. So we're looking at the end of economics as we understand it today, whether you call it your favorite economic theory is socialism or fascism or communism or capitalism. Those don't work in a world where the population's in collapse. We've got to figure out something new. But in the United States and in Mexico, the 2 healthiest demographies in the world, we have bare minimum another 35 years. So we got to watch everyone else wrestle with this while we continue with business as normal and just kind of see if there are any tricks that we can pick up along the way. The United States is the least integrated major power in the global economy in the world, and that's by design. We created globalization to build an alliance to fight the Soviets. So if we had been the dominant economic power in that, it wouldn't have worked. So we basically informally agreed to run massive trade deficits, and globalization has been successful in integrating 2 economic sectors from the United States and the wider world. Only 2. One of those is agriculture, because our farmers and ranchers are just so ridiculously productive that they have to sell outside of the United States. So based on whether you're a farmer or rancher, you're in pork or corn or whatever, there's going to be some adjustments that are going to be uncomfortable. Manufacturing is the second one, specifically tech manufacturing. What makes tech manufacturing work is having access to multiple different skill levels and different price levels so that every specific part can be made in a place with maximum competitive advantage, and then you shuttle it to the next spot to add the next piece. And in that, China has been great. China is not exactly a one-stop shop, but you've got technocracies right across the water in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. You've got countries that are poorer like Vietnam and Indonesia nearby. And so you can have a great system, and tech has outsourced their entire manufacturing base to this part of the world. That's where we're going to feel it. Because that's going to break. You don't rebuild that overnight. And the Mexicans are wonderful, but in northern Mexico, there's only 30 million Mexicans. So there's a limit to how much of this that we can build before we can figure out a new, more automated way of doing the construction. So between now and 2030, that's going to probably be the biggest pinch in our system, is just computing and cell phones and electronics, fax machines, servers, all that kind of stuff. That all has to come back. It is all coming back, but you have to unwind 40 years of globalization in a very short period of time. We need to, bare minimum, double our industrial plant in the next 5 years. And while that will end us in a much better place than where we are now, the road from there is going to be bumpy, and there's going to be a lot of inflation because, this stuff isn't free to build. The United States is the global currency. We're the only global currency. What's going on in Russia right now has sent a huge flight of capital from the entire world to the US. It is becoming clearer and clearer and clearer that the more you break down the globalization, the better the US does in terms of financial centrality. And in that environment, even if we're using sanctions to cut off the world's 11th largest economy, people are still putting their money here because there is no other option. There is no competitor to the US dollar. Bitcoin is laughably incapable of providing any sort of sustenance for this system. The Chinese yuan is locked off from the world because whenever they open it, people get their money out of China as soon as they can and get into dollars. The euro is a regional currency, and now that it's under threat from the Russians, they're seeing capital flight. There's just nothing else in play. And when that is the case, the checkbook doesn't really matter. You have to worry about checkbook logistics when you're a normal currency and the balance of payments is critical. But the United States is not in that situation. We decide what the money supply is, and we are the world's single largest store of value by a large margin, and we are the largest trade currency by a large margin. As long as that is the case, the United States has the exorbitant privilege, if you want to use the technical term, of printing currency in nearly any volume it wants to. In addition, we kind of get like an $800 billion a year freebie in that, because as long as we're expanding at roughly 3% growth, which is what we've been doing for decades, if you print, or if you have a budget deficit of 800 billion, that comes out to about 3% of GDP. So the relative debt load doesn't increase. Think of what's happened under Biden and Trump. The two biggest deficits we've ever had, 20% of GDP at one point, and the dollar's still